Okay, here we go. So what we're going to do here is we started off with an overview lecture of why this class and what we're going to cover. And I'm going to go back and pull that together. Let me just see. What?
Those look like all of my Word files during the day.
You know, how do we end up with?
What's that one?
No. Wait, no, hold on one sec.
Well, you'd think we could have.
Oh, I know what it is. We went. Here it is. Okay, now let me do it. Here we go. Yeah, now we're all set. So this is our overview lecture, and I'm going to go back and change this now because of the stuff we did over the last year and a half, whatever. But why did we create this course? Okay. Well, there's a survey that's available that shows that the fastest growing religious affiliation is none. By that, I think the question that was asked, they're spiritual, but not affiliated with any organized faith or sect, okay? And it shows you the United States had, was founded by people who came here for religious freedom. There was a huge burst of religion, and religion being part of daily life from 1820 to the Civil War. And then everything just really swung over time toward materialism. And the religious or spiritual side has just been not a meaningful part of a lot of people's lives. And that's one thing we think we should try and correct here. Another thing that comes up is the science piece, that after 500 years, Western science has realized that what it thinks of as matter and energy encompasses 5% of the universe, and the other 95% is called dark. Now, if you the dark really should be transparent, or we can't see it, as opposed to dark. Okay, and this is really, mind-boggling that people have refined this. So out of the 95%, they think 27% is dark matter, and if I add 27 plus 5, I get 32. So then that means 68% is dark energy, but no one knows what dark matter is or dark energy. So
it really just means unknown.
Right, it really means unknown. So here's one way I came up with trying to think about this. Okay, we've seen that we had someone like Albert Einstein who talked about the equivalence of mass and energy, and he had an equation, E equals mc squared. So energy and mass are proportional to one another, E equals mc squared. That's something to keep in mind, but that's for, you think of that for mass or for particles. Okay, the flip side to it is what about for waves? What happens there? And here we had Max Planck, who came up with energy equals Planck's constant times the frequency of vibration of the wave. So the energy is proportional to the frequency of the wave, and so that suggests that if we've only got 5% of the universe as mass or vibrating energy waves, and we're in 3 spatial dimensions, okay, then where's the other vibrations, the other 95%? Well, all you should think about is, okay, if I've got 3 dimensions and 5% is 1/20th, okay, then if I divide 3 dimensions by 1/20, I get 60 dimensions. I need a lot more dimensions to be able to encompass all of this other vibrations and mass that are out there. And what we saw before, when we've done this, is 60 is an overestimate. It should be 24 spatial dimensions. But it gets across the point that the action is really occurring in these other realms. Okay, we're seeing a very small piece of it, and so it goes. And what goes along with that, was we spent a lot of time talking about how to play games with the 24 dimensions and so forth. So we'll come back to that, but that's something to just keep in mind, why we need these extra dimensions. And then finally, when we've dealt with the science side of things, I just gave you an example where we're trying to be, in some sense, mystical, because the other dimensions in religion or even in art would be called the higher realms. And there would be, for example, not simply the dimensions, but there'd be music occurring there, and things like this, the artistic piece. And so that's what we're trying to deal with here is
And music isn't all math.
music is I mean, it is math, but it isn't math. I mean,
And vibration.
yeah, and it's the instruments that we're aware of are causing air to vibrate, right? Just like when I'm talking to you, that's what I do. Okay, so we start off with the actual first side of things is trying to deal with mysticism and science. And here we draw on a lot of work by Ron Cowan, where he was clairvoyant, and he made a lot of very interesting observations. For example, he observed an electron. Now we have all of these books and everything else on electricity, and nobody doubts that an electron exists. It's just that no one has an idea what an electron looks like. And Ron was able to show that it's actually shaped as a torus, as a donut, but it's got wrapped around it 10 strings, and the strings are all closed. And so the strings are vibrating. And then on top of that, it's coated with blocks of information that are constantly scanning the world around it, trying to see, is there any change? So that takes us off into this area of string theory, where we have these vibrating strings, and it takes us off into the mystical side, the Kabbalah, where what we saw was that there's actually going to be a 10-dimensional space there that matches the 10 Sephiroth of the Kabbalah. We went from that topic of mysticism and science, then we went into Eastern spirituality and Western esotericism, and just tried to contrast the different approaches between these things. And the Eastern has, significant things to recommend it. But we also are going to cover here, in particular, women and their role in all of this, and the native shamans and their role in all of this, because they're all over the planet. Then we went off into transcendentalism, where we're dealing with the Unitarian side of things with Emerson and Thoreau and
Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman.
Yeah, and Walcott. What's his name? Branson Alcott. He was they were all these transcendentalists there in the Concord, Massachusetts area, but they were very mystical at the same time. And so this is a little, aside into the whole thing. Then we went off onto big picture, meaning astronomy and cosmology. And really, this is something that is built on observations, and that the fact that the optical telescopes around the year 1900 got better and better, and then we were able to go into other frequency ranges besides optical, to go into X-ray and to go into infrared, and now they've got gravitational instruments that can measure gravity waves coming out of these things. So astronomy has had this huge change where it's had much better data, and this has led to a huge amount of activity on what initially was called the Big Bang, but because what we saw was that everything was running away from everything else. That was a fundamental observation by Edwin Hubble in the 1920s. So that everything was expanding, space itself was expanding, which meant that space itself, if you run time backwards, space would be, a very small area, and that was called the Big Bang, which was meant to be a joke. But as all these jokes go, it caught on. Everybody liked Big Bang, and then they discovered it really wasn't a bang; it was a bounce. So, and it wasn't big either. So there was no sound. It wasn't big, and it was a bounce. That's what we got out of this after 100+ years of observations. Okay, and then we took a diversion off into some things related to the actual art side of things, for the music, painting, sculpture, dance, poetry. I know that I've always felt that certain pieces of music to me were mystical, that I just found myself carried away. So as one example, I've listened to many performances of Handel's Messiah, and I found that to be, every time I listen to it, it seems to be deeper and more mystical. But other things, like George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, I find to be, to me, incredibly mystical. It just depends on what you think, whatever resonates there. And then we had other examples. For example, Marjorie has this gentleman who did these, what was it called? Dances. They were sacred.
The Dances of Universal Peace.
Dances of Universal Peace.
DUP. They were the guy who founded them he grew up Jewish, and then he became a Sufi master. He was ordained and recognized as a Sufi cleric, which is they're the mystical branch of Islam. They are to Islam as the Kabbalists are to Judaism, and there's a lot of overlap. They cross-pollinated a lot. And he was also recognized, I forget the exact term, but as a Buddhist master. And he created these dances that incorporate sacred music from every tradition in the world. And these very special dances with mudras that you do with your hands and your fingers. So these postures. So it's an energetic practice. If you're an energy practitioner, you really feel it. And I think even if you're not, something is going on. And you dance in a circle, and the energy is just incredible. And and part of the goal was to introduce them in the Middle East to be used for peace work between the Muslims and the Jews and the Christians as well. There are a lot of Christians kind of caught in the conflict there. and they're used, and it's done very successfully. And it was exactly the same concept that I had with the labyrinth and what I wanted to do with the peace labyrinth in the Unitarian Church. And then I learned about these dances, and I said, oh my God, he's using the exact same language that was coming to me. That I said we should, have meals, and if you break bread and dance and sing and chant and walk a labyrinth with your enemies, you can't remain enemies. You just can't. It's like that story about in World War I, there was a truce for Christmas, I think. And the two sides came together and they refused to go back to killing each other. They just couldn't do it. So the officers came and shot at them until they got back to war, But I do believe that there are things like this that really can have a very real impact and ripple effect. If you start small, you do it within a limited community as a microcosm, and it sent out ripples. And as people learn about it, so we're going through this whole thing in our church right now. Do we want to adopt? Our denomination is named Unitarian Universalist. They were two different, completely different, this time period that we were talking about. Actually, the Universalists were the largest sect of Christianity in the United States. And so the two merged at one point? When?
1961.
1961.
The Universalists had all the money, and the Unitarians had all the members, but no money.
So we joined forces because there's a lot of overlap, but they are also different. So there's this whole thing going on, are we going to add that to our congregation's name? And it looks like we are. So I've been sending out letters. Well, then, okay, we have to learn what universalism really is. It's not just saying, oh, everything's good. It doesn't mean universalist in that way. So I want to do a unit on this guy. His name was Samuel Lewis, who I guess he kind of spiritually downloaded these dances of universal peace. It's just otherworldly when you do it. We've had 70 people. It was some anniversary of September 11th and the war kind of thing, of strangers just getting tears down their faces as they come together. And we had every age. We had people in their 90s to kids at like 6 years old, and not all from our congregation by any means, mostly from outside. And it's incredibly healing. And to have each thread of each faith, I feel, is unique and has its own energy that's incredible. And it's important to recognize the differences as well as what's universal. But each one brings its own flavor of the divine in a unique way that is really powerful to experience. And so these are a discipline in and of themselves. And we had this guy come all the way down, he was happy to do it, from Rhode Island, to come lead us in these dances. And he pulled in musicians from all over the East Coast, a lot in Connecticut, to do this live music in a certain way. And they almost kind of channel the music. It's really interesting how they work. They can play things that they've never played before. One of them will play like the first bar of a piece, and they'll look at each other, and the other one will pick up the whole piece. I swear, I'm not exaggerating.
No, that's what you do in jazz.
But there's some improv, but they're also very traditional pieces from every tradition, and it's just, to me, it was just, I felt, 6 feet off the ground. And then we would either do the labyrinth before it or the labyrinth after. We were experimenting. dancing on the labyrinth, doing all different permutations of it with this intention of world peace. And then we would have some kind of action that we would commit to, like a donation for solar stoves for Darfur or something like that. But again, I saw it as acting on the microcosm with the intention of the macrocosm being part of the ripple effect. And it was, so I hope we can get back to doing that kind of thing with the end of COVID, but I have no idea how to do that with masks and gloves and the whole thing.
The other stuff that we had here, painting. So, people think of things like the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel as being something that takes you into something that's mystic. But, I think of something like the paintings of Jackson Pollock, which I found mesmerizing, and you stare at these things and try and, just you really zone out.
It's all about space.
Right.
The depth of space that he was.
Right. And for sculpture, people point to in Firenze, the David that Michelangelo did, which is, incredible. But, I also think of things that Rodin did or I was in Oslo, and there's a whole park there loaded up with all kinds of sculptures from this Norwegian that I also found very mystical. So it's not confined to any modality. We get it in poetry. We can see different poems that definitely launch us in that direction. But it just shows how deep the texture is for mysticism, how it can encompass so many different things here.
Well, and I think it's also the way it's framed and presented in schools and things like that. I had a completely different response to reading Shakespeare with my mother, who was an English teacher, late in her life after her stroke. And I don't know why, all of a sudden I said, oh my God, it's incredibly mystical. And she said, of course it is. Are you just seeing that now? And I was only seeing it, I was my 40s, the first time I really recognized the mysticism in Romeo and Juliet. So I just wasn't ready to see it until then. And I think a lot of things are like that. It wasn't just about romance. It was about the soul,
Yeah. And the final area that we've spent time on was Jung and his Gnosticism, the different concepts he came up with of this collective unconscious and the archetypes that go with it, and then this overlap with Wolfgang Pauli and Jung meeting and trading letters for decades, exploring this notion of synchronicity and so forth. So that is the topics where we're gonna put different emphasis on different things this year. And
since you guys are sticking around, we're going to go deeper.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. So the premise that we built this on was there's all of these different sects and faiths out there, and our belief is that as we've said again and again, it's thinking of the elephant, that someone goes up and grabs the tusk of the elephant or the nose of the elephant or the ear of the elephant or the tail of the elephant or the leg of the elephant, and they focus on that piece of things to the exclusion of everything else, and they miss that there's really an elephant there that actually ties things together. There's a single underlying unifying entity that's created everything. When I look out the window and I look at the world out there, and that entity governs the creation and the evolution, and it expresses love within itself, and wants each of us to love one another, and that's really what we think is going on here. But it doesn't fall into any single existing dogmatic faith. Maybe people see it differently, but I don't. I keep running into people that are trying to typecast you into a particular category, or oh, you're a Buddhist, or you're a Christian, or whatever it is, and that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to look for the unifying themes that tie everything together. So
something that is said with the dances of universal peace is, and I do believe it comes out of Islam, actually, the teaching that, the divine loves us so much that the divine inspired all these different religions, because each one is like a facet of a jewel that is seeing different divine truths and different divine beauty, so that we would have this multifaceted experience and symbolic representation, because it can't be just like summed up, like 2 + 2 = 5. It's got to be indicated through metaphor and symbol. So there's all these different languages to do that in, so that we can see the richness and the variety. That's part of the point. I never encountered that thought before, which I thought was really powerful. And they said, well, so the divine didn't create just one kind of flower. Look at the hundreds and thousands and millions of different kinds of flowers that we have all over the planet. And, so you can't say, well, really the daisy is so honest and simple, it's much better than a rose. And somebody else could say, well, no, but a rose is so elegant, and, those thorns are so ironic, a daisy is so boring in comparison. But it's the idea of the diversity of them, the variety in itself is mind-boggling. So that was part of why the different cultures have evolved, and why the different religious views, so that it's not that we can just see what's universal, it's so that we can also appreciate what's unique, and that each one has a flavor that's powerful and beautiful in its own right. And it's not only what they have in common, it's also what sets them apart. So personally, I consider my ministry, I was ordained in 2006, and actually in a goddess tradition, but I've always considered my ministry to be interfaith. And that's the kind of thing that really moves me. And I just wish we could get people, it's just the worst thing in the world that people are killing each other over their religious ideas. It just can't come to that.
Yeah. Okay, so we touched upon briefly that there were a number of Christian mystics. People think, oh, well, they're these Buddhist or Hindu mystics, these gurus, they live in caves or whatever, but there are a number of Christian mystics floating around that Andrew Harvey was able to capture their teachings and a variety of lessons to take away. So the one thing to keep in mind here, even in the highest and final stages of mystical illumination, a crucial gap still remains between the creator and the creature that necessitates a continuing practice of prayer, contemplation, and service. So we start with that. Enlightenment is not in any sense a static state of omniscience or oneness, with being, as the Eastern religions have tended to represent it, but a continually opening up to an evolution in love. So that's enlightenment is an evolution in love. Now, the price for such infinite growth and expansion in love is a heroic embrace of the laws of suffering and ordeal. To accept the demands of love is to accept the cross and the extreme suffering that comes with it. No mystical, hold on one second. No mystical training is authentic unless it results in a total commitment to other beings into the service of justice and compassion in all forms in the creation. So that was his takeaway, Andrew Harvey's, on the Christian side of things, the Christian mystics, which if you step back and look at this, it could be very Buddhist in that sense. He trademarked this term, sacred activism. Do you want to say anything about this?
Well, I'm having trouble reading tonight. Do you want to
Okay.
read?
Well, what's going on right now is he's arguing is a extremely painful and complete transformation of humanity. And this won't be simply an individual, it'll have to be structural, and it will take place on all levels, economic, political, spiritual, emotional, all at once and very fast.
He is talking about now, with the pandemic and everything. And he is giving a lot of, I believe a lot of them are free, lectures and workshops and things online.
Yeah.
We should send out announcements for some of that.
Yeah, he's very articulate.
Did he grow up Hindu?
I think he grew up in India, I think.
Yes, definitely. But I'm not sure if he was Christian or Hindu or like a little of both.
Right, I don't know. But what he's arguing here is anyone who isn't prepared to see the extremity of what's happening is enabling a disaster for themselves. So you have to be prepared for the intense work that's required to make love in action, to make that an integral part of your life, and allowing the dark to destroy the planet. The dark side of things is probably going to lose in all of this. But between now and then, there's going to be a lot of things happening. So this is really the time when humanity will either call for a revolution of love in action on every level, or some will die out in unspeakable suffering and despair. And that's the bad news. It's time that everyone is adult enough to hear it. But the good news is that this death could be the birth canal of an unprecedented birth, the birth of an embodied divine humanity that lives in humble harmony with the creation. For years, I've been aware of both this death and this potential rebirth. And I want to offer you these resources of vision and practice and inspiration that I know from my inmost experiences can guide you through anything and keep you aligned with truth and joy, whatever happens. So I think we would all agree that we're not going into simply turbulent times. These are things that no one's ever seen before, and he's trying to frame it in a way to help people get through it, and we'll see what happens.
Is it coming up here? Yeah, I think what he said. Yeah, this is my favorite.
Right.
A spirituality that is only private and self-absorbed, one divide of an authentic political and social consciousness, does little to halt the suicidal juggernaut of history. On the other hand, an activism that is not purified by profound spiritual and psychological self-awareness and rooted in divine truth, wisdom, and compassion will only perpetuate the problem it is trying to solve, however righteous its intentions. When, however, the deepest and most grounded spiritual vision is married to a practical and pragmatic drive to transform all existing political, economic, and social institutions, a holy force, the power of wisdom and love in action, is born. This force I define as sacred activism. So that's from Andrew Harvey. And that's what I named my program at the church that I was doing before the tsunami that hit my life came along. But that was the context that I was introducing the labyrinth and for this kind of interfaith work for peace and justice. So I feel that the Unitarian faith is a really good container for it, you know, and a really good context for it. And working with this universalist, you know, I hope we can pick up the threads. You know, I hope that we get to a point in the pandemic and the you know, the kind of nuclear or economic fallout that we're dealing with, where we can even explore these kinds of things again.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll try and find, he has a number of YouTube videos that are very stimulating, thought-provoking. So
he interviews a lot of people. And so you get, if you watch him interview a lot of people, you get a real sense of where he's coming from because of the way he interacts with the various people from various faiths and points of view.
We touched upon Coleridge here, who way before Emerson wrote, "Life is one universal soul, which by virtue of the enlivening breath and the informed forming word, all organized bodies have in common, each after its kind. This therefore all animals possess, man is an animal, but in addition to this, God transfused into man a higher gift and specially inbreathed, even a living, that is I can't read it, subsisting soul, a soul having a life in itself."
You can put that across the bottom.
I can stick it down here, yeah. Okay, and so, oops. And man became a living soul. He did not merely possess it, he became it. It was his proper being, his truest self, the man in the man. And this would be, later he claims that in his soul, nothing is wanted but the eye, which is the light of this house, the light, which is the eye of the soul, this seen light, this enlightened eye is reflection. So here I think he's actually trying to get across to me the notion of enlightenment or oneness or non-duality in terms of trying to achieve this.
And that's where the phrase that I just went blank. Go scroll up a little bit. Keep going.
More?
Yeah, Emerson is known for the phrase about the invisible eyeball, but he got it from Coleridge.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
That's what is, you know, being referenced in the subtext there, is that phrase of the invisible eyeball.
Right. So a different idea here, the universe is a thought of the deity. Since this ideal thought form has overflowed into actuality and the world born thereof has realized the plan of its creator, it's the calling of all thinking beings to rediscover in this existent whole the original design. This is from Friedrich Schiller, who was a playwright and poet at the end of the 1700s, early 1800s. That deeply emotional conviction of the presence of a superior reasoning power, which is revealed in the incomprehensible universe, forms my idea of God, Albert Einstein. Fools give you answers, wise men never try. That's from Some Enchanted Evening in South Pacific. A man is always a teller of tales. He lives surrounded by his stories and the stories of others. He sees everything that happens to him through them, and he tries to live his life as if he were recounting it. Jean-Paul Sartre. So this is one thing that Jesus of Nazareth obviously keyed on, was the tales would be the things that people would remember. You yourself are the easiest one to fool. Richard Feynman. And then our mistake is not that we take our theories too seriously, but that we do not take them seriously enough. And it's always hard to realize that these numbers and equations we play with at our desks have something to do with the real world. Steven Weinberg, Nobel Physics laureate. And then we had a variety of these pictures here. Einstein, for example, reality is merely an illusion, albeit a very persistent one, okay? And the one that everybody remembers, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Feynman down here, the real glory of science is that we can find a way of thinking such that the law is evident. That's a very tricky one to sort out. A popular cliche in philosophy says that science is pure analysis or reductionism, like taking the rainbow to pieces, and art is pure synthesis, putting the rainbow together. This is not so. All imagination begins by analyzing nature, science, art, and so forth. And then we had our guy, David Bohm, over here. A great many people think they're thinking when they're merely rearranging their prejudices. And then finally, Einstein, who was asked how it felt to be the smartest man alive, and Einstein replied, "I don't know, you'll have to ask Nikola Tesla." And then we have many, many pictures. We just picked a few here, just showing, here's a shaman here. Here's, probably some sort of Nostradamus look-alike. Here's Moses over here, on and on. So all of these things are pictures that are trying to convey something mystical is going on here. And the sort of readings that we came up with here, we're going to go back and revisit this, but Jung and Pauli had this book called Adam and Archetype, which I believe this is the book of their correspondence from 1930 to 1957, I think, and so forth. Whereas this book down here on symmetry that we touched on, we're going to come back to this because this really shows there's an incredible mystic side to this symmetry that we skipped over, and I'll just try and emphasize it. And then way back when, in 1975, Friedhof Capra had the Tao of Physics, where he was arguing that physics had hit a dead end in its advances and should start to turn toward the east, which is something that David Bohm had also said, that you're not going to find it, just like the way Einstein said, doing the same thing over and over again. It's not there. And you're going to have to look outside the box and look at what these people in the East were doing.
That's one of the books that brought us together,
Right.
that we both read it decades ago. And all of a sudden, I just knew that Bart must have read it, and that we've been on these two parallel tracks, for these decades, thinking about these things from different points of view. We thought initially we would do a debate kind of format, but we just kept ending up laughing because we agree too much. We couldn't do it. We couldn't keep a straight face.
There's a gentleman, Ira Progoff, who wrote a very nice book on Jung, synchronicity, and human destiny. And that's something that we drew on for some of these classes here. And we'll come back to that. And then more.
And if you want to deepen your own experience this time around, reading more of these would definitely do that for you. That's something else that.
Yeah, we could set up special sections where we just discuss a series of these books, as opposed to what we've been doing in the past. There are lots of possibilities here. These two books, Darcy Wentworth Thompson was actually a mathematician, but definitely thought way outside the box and came up with a lot of ideas that would now be called, it's called morphology, topology, dealing with shapes of all sorts, and all kinds of amazing things that come out of that. He was, I would say probably 50 years ahead of his time, not 25. He was just way, way beyond everybody else. And Hamlet's Mill.
And he overlapped with Darwin.
Yes.
But was way ahead of Darwin with his ideas about evolution.
Yeah.
Which I think were much more sophisticated than Darwin's. It's a shame they're so little known.
Yeah, he's actually, it is picked up on by this guy, Michael Levin, who's at Tufts University. And if you look at some of his YouTube videos, you'll see him picking up on the ideas of Darcy Wentworth Thompson. But he's still very much in the minority of what I would say is mainstream biology, because mainstream biology has gone off very much into genetics and genomics and gathering gigantic data sets and sequencing things, and you're down in the weeds, and you miss what the forest looks like, which is what Darcy Thompson was dealing with.
I was blessed to write an essay about him, to research and write the essay in 2002, and that's posted on the website. And that this is another of the things that we had in common. And all of a sudden, I just knew Bart had to know about him and his work. And I sent him my essay, and Bart sent back half a dozen references to other people whose work had been influenced by his. But Bart knew the subsequent thinking from that. And then we also had this in common.
Yeah, Hamlet's Mill by Giorgio de Santillana and Goethe van Decken. And this was done, the edition that we cited here was indeed published in 2020, but I think this was done in the 1960s, something like that.
But it was after Jung had died, and so Jung wasn't influenced by it at all. And it's
Jung died in 61. Right. And so it's after that. So these are really seminal books that drove things, and that takes us up to this thing, which is a great set of observations by Ron Cowan, where Ron was able to go into deep meditation and go down into the microcosm and focus on an electron as a particle moving through a single slit, and then the two slits are replaced by the single slits replaced by two slits, and all of a sudden the electron detects that. What he saw was the electron is coated with these blocks of information that are scanning the world all around it. It detected all of a sudden there's two slits there, not one. So the electron immediately becomes a wave. And this happens, virtually instantaneously.
And we're finding more
But-
new videos on this as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah,
And I'm working on connecting that to the phenomenon that we call Mercury retrograde. Because it's like, well, if it's an illusion, why does it matter? Is the question, the logical question. And I think it's something like this. I think it has to do with the awareness of it, even, or the impression of it, the illusion of it, that being in the collective has a reality, just a thought form itself has some kind of a reality, like the scanning of the electrons. You could call that an awareness. I don't know how sentient they are, but there's some kind of,
so it's lawful. That's what it is.
right. And there's some kind of conformity to, the message that it gets about the slits.
Yeah. So Ron, this is really seminal work. This experiment was first done, 100 years ago, and again, physicists have asked themselves, what in the world is going on here? And Ron was the one who carried out the observations to show that this is what happened. Then there's this area I just called mysticism in mathematics, where mathematicians decided to study symmetries, and they gave this activity something called group theory. Group theory deals with different types of symmetries, and there are a number of really great mathematicians that studied this, and they came up with large classes of symmetry. But what was disturbing about this, in the study of symmetry, they uncovered things that weren't symmetrical. There were 5 so-called exceptional groups that were tied to the octonians, and the octonians are a number system based on these 8 entities. We deal with real numbers, imaginary numbers. Then we go to quaternions, which are a 4-fold set of numbers, and octonians, which are an 8-fold set of numbers. And this was very disturbing, that the study of symmetry led to 5 things that were, in some sense, not really symmetrical, and they were tied to this octonian idea. And we're going to come back to this, and you'll see why this ties together. This is just the tip of the iceberg here, but it was a hint that there was something mystical going on there that had been placed in front of us. After another 100 years, mathematicians went ahead and they did this incredible study of all possible symmetries in a particular class of symmetries that they're dealing with. And this is not something for the faint of heart. It's a 10,000-page document that has many authors. So this was done over a period of years, pulling all this together, and it involved extensive use of computers to make sure that nothing got missed. So in going through that, all of these symmetries were uncovered, just like back 100 years ago. But the problem was there were things that weren't symmetric. They just decided to call them sporadic. And there's one which came up, which is called the monster group. And we'll see where that comes in the higher realms. The monster group gets its name because it lives in 196,886 dimensions, and it has a little under 10 to the 54th elements to it. 10 to the 54th is a number that's hard to characterize. So I'll just leave you with this thought that people have carried out calculations showing that if we looked at all the atoms in the Milky Way galaxy, we'd come up with 10 to the 40th atoms in the Milky Way galaxy. So this is 10 to the 54th, which means that it's a million, 100 million bigger than all the atoms in the Milky Way galaxy. That's when you see something like this, you wonder what's going on, and it's a tip-off that there's an artist at work here. There's whenever people have discovered anything in mathematics that they thought was worthless, then shortly thereafter someone finds some use for it, typically based on something that happens in reality in the world around you. And that's what we'll see with this monster group, is it has to do with the higher realms, with the things that we would call spirits and souls, and the dimensional spaces that they live in. One of the things that started all of this off was astronomy driving science. And so people, again, observed with their eyeballs what was happening, and they came up with the notion of the Earth rotating every 24 hours, and the notion of seasons, and going through a set of seasons every year. But even more tricky, they observed that the equinox precess, that the Earth's axis wobbles a little bit, and it goes through each of the 12 houses of the zodiac. And each one takes 2,160 years. So it takes a total of 25,000 years for one wobble. But you know, this is heavy duty observation, trying to come up with this. And this was all done. Again, there weren't any telescopes or anything. People just did this with their eyes and using sticks, and noting where different things occurred at different points in the day and in the night. You know, just totally amazing. So
it was usually the shaman's job to do this, and he would be the one that was initiated into these mysteries. It was usually a he, but he and an assistant would set sticks up on a hill a few miles away, so that they could watch exactly where the sun came up every day, and they would measure. That's how they got the concept of degrees. Comes from the root word dag for day. And so that's how they realized how cyclical it was, and how many degrees, how many days there are in a given cycle for the sun and the moon. And they were very aware of the phenomenon of the fixed stars not being the same backdrop year after year. So they were recording these things and passing them on somehow for generations. And this is what Hamlet's Mill really makes the case, that it was a source of real existential angst for people. That saying is constant as the North Star from Shakespeare is totally ironic. It's not constant. The North Star changes just about every 2,000 years. And everything shifts with it in this big, clock-like rotation that they were aware of and anxious about. They were very concerned about it. They thought, well, will it be the end of the world as we know it? And in some way, I think it always is. That's what we're going through now.
Another thing to keep in mind is this is a very Western centric view. So there were these observations by Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler of the planets and so forth, that then led to some quantification by Newton and Galileo to create this term gravity, which was governing how all of these things moved. And Newton was asked, well, what is gravity? And he says, I don't know, but it follows these equations. And I'll leave that for someone else to go figure out what it is. So Newton was smart enough to know that he wasn't going to be able to figure it out. And he left that for other people. And that leads us up to someone like Henri Poincaré, who around the year 1900 wrote a basic paper. He was testing whether or not the solar system is stable or not. You know, for example, how do we know that the Earth won't take a left-hand turn and dive into the sun in the next 20 minutes? How stable is the solar system? Why doesn't it all fly apart? Whatever. And he studied this stuff, and he realized there was this phenomenon called chaos that arose there, that he could end up having small little perturbations of his observations would lead to just incredibly different outcomes. This was in the jargon of the weather people. It's called the butterfly effect, where a butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, and that leads to a hurricane in Georgia. But no one could predict this. And Poincaré looked at this and said, "My God, this is like so bizarre. I didn't sign up to do this sort of math." So he dropped the whole thing and ran away from it. But other people picked it up, but it took another 60 years to go ahead and do that. And then we mentioned Hubble, who observed that all of the galaxies are moving away from one another, building on the work of this chap over at Flagstaff, who was the one who first planted the seed of this idea in 1910, 1912. Hubble, followed up on it in like 1925. And this definitely influenced Einstein with his theory of general relativity. Now, we then ended up with another chap at Caltech, Fritz Zwicky, who was looking at the galaxies there and realizing, well, they contain all these stars and they're rotating around the center. So let me assume that each of the stars has a mass of, one unit of sun mass. We take the sun as a normal star, and there's 100 million of these in a galaxy. Let's let it rotate and see what happens. And he realized that there wasn't enough gravitational attraction to hold the galaxies together. They would just fly apart. But that isn't what he saw. So he said, my gosh, there must be some extra matter out there, which I can't see, which I'll call dark matter, that's hidden. And it's pulling together all of these different stars as they rotate around the center of the galaxy and so forth. And then we come up to Feynman, who in the early 60s, there were hints in Einstein's work of having an anomaly or a singularity called a black hole, something that was so intense in its gravitation that nothing could escape from it, including light. So you wouldn't see it. It's black, or it's a black hole. You throw anything at it and it disappears into it. And there were some initial indications in the early 1960s, and Feynman, looked at these things and said, my God, there's a black hole at the center of the Milky Way galaxy, which totally went over the head of the people that did the observations. And they went back and started to learn what a black hole was. And they said, my God, he's right. And every galaxy appears to have a massive black hole there.
So that's part of the equation. That's
right.
Part of the makeup of the galaxy.
Right. But the one in the center of the Milky Way galaxy has an apparent mass of 4 million suns. So if we took our sun as one unit, you'd have 4 million. I might be wrong. It might be 4 billion of these. But there's other galaxies that have totally mind-boggling, like 100 million or 100 billion sun masses for their black hole, just completely dwarfing what we've got.
And where do they go? Maybe they go into one of those tunnels, so it's wormholes.
Right, right. So,
the
and
other
then,
dimensions.
and then the other thing that came up was this classmate of mine, Alan Guth, who was looking at this Big Bang or Big Bounce, and he came up with viewing it as a change in phase, where we have something like ice that's totally locked in, and as things start to heat up and melt, it changes phase. It expands rapidly. But what he's talking about in inflation here is that space itself is expanding. Space itself is going from a small little compartment to a compartment that was, in his case, 30 orders of magnitude bigger, and in an incredibly short period of time. Much faster, for example, than the speed of light, having space itself inflate. So these are all things that just came out of observations of looking at the stars. And they're saying, you're asking yourself, where in the world did this come from? Who in the world ever created this? And this is some of the, again, mysticism that we see of dealing with science. So
to me, it just keeps opening up the mystery, more and more. It just shows more and more of how mysterious the whole thing is.
Yeah, and that's why you should, think outside the box in terms of doing this stuff. So we had the original view of space and time from Newton, where there was space itself with 3 dimensions, and then there was time, which itself was separate, and it just rolled along, and that was how the world worked. End of story. The only problem was it was wrong. Yeah, but it wasn't bad for first cut, since there wasn't anything that anyone had ever done before this. So what happened here with Newton was that we start off with this notion of these 3 dimensions in space and 1 in time, and then we start to get things to move faster and faster toward the speed of light, and we discover that space and time are coupled. When you start to do this, that's the only way you can really make sense of it, so that time itself will slow down as the faster you go. And when we deal with general relativity, this is where we're in a very intense gravitational field. We discover that space and time are coupled, and the gravitational field, the stronger it is, the stronger the warping of the space and time fabric that makes up everything. And so time will slow down again as gravitational fields get stronger and stronger. And then finally, we have this area of statistical mechanics where time actually has an arrow. It points only in one direction. The problem is we have to ask ourselves, how does it move? Where does that come from? So this led us to this picture here of this that Ron Cowan came up with. That's a 26-dimensional space, which we'll come back to again and again. But we have 4 dimensions for matter and 4 for dark matter, but they're actually, as we'll see, coupled together. This would be the real part for matter, and the imaginary part would be the dark matter piece. And so there are 4 real dimensions for each of these, or there's really 4. There's a single 4 complex dimensional space here that's sitting here. And similarly down here, we have these 6 compactified dimensions. But again, there's 3 that are real and 3 that are imaginary. And so we have 2 of these, a single, we have either 2 real 3-dimensional spaces here for each of the matter and dark matter, or we have a single complex 3-dimensional space for matter and dark matter, and similarly for this thing at the very bottom for coupling everything. And so it goes. What came out of all this also was just there's a hierarchy that always comes out of this. The most fundamental piece parts are always in the physics piece. These are things called atoms and the parts that make up atoms. That's where physics says, well, we call the shots. Everything starts with us. Whereas chemistry ends up dealing with aggregations of these things that lead to some very interesting behavior that you could easily miss if you're just down in the weeds of physics. And finally, we go into biology, which can play games with the materials that happen in chemistry, and we can have things that are both inanimate but also animate and sentient as well. And this leads to some amazing additional properties here that would have been missed by the physicists. And so it goes. So let me just go down.
So we don't have our redos of this diagram in here.
No, I'm going to go replace that. Yeah, so this is what I was looking for, was the first thing we're going to deal with is a foundations lecture where we deal with really in a more precise way, what's the problem, what's going on here, how do we really compare statements that some people make with other people. You can have situations where people don't state their underlying assumptions, and so they could be saying things that appear to contradict one another when actually they're both right because they have different assumptions. If they had the same assumptions, then that wouldn't be the case. But you have to get this out in the open, and so that's why it's important to deal at the very beginning with the foundational side of things. There's also the notion of Eastern versus Western mysticism, and we'll touch on that as part of the foundations. One of the things that's happened is that Western science has been pushed toward having these experiments and carrying out modeling and then trying to interpret things. And one of the problems with doing this is that they start to miss certain things that are going on. For example, Ron Cowan could only do what he was doing through intense meditation. And that meant that he couldn't take any experimental tools with him. He couldn't have anything that would measure length, measure a length of any sort. He couldn't see any notion of time of any sort. But he made do with what he could do, and that's one of the reasons why Western science has tended to disparage doing these things. But he got quite a long ways beyond where Western science is by not being hung up on these ideas. So the thing that we come up with, again and again, is being a prisoner of this mindset of being able to measure things, always carry out experiments that other people can repeat. We're not disputing not having other people carry out the same observations that someone like Ron did, but the thing that goes with it is you have to spend the years and decades that he spent in incredible meditation to be able to go achieve this, and a lot of Western scientists are not willing to do that, but there are a lot of people in the East that have that can do that and could validate what he saw. We're going to spend some time looking at the Bible, for example. I'm just going to skip over this for right now, and that will take us into the second module, the second subject, which is the science and religion.
I just want to
Go ahead.
interject something right there. If you read, well, let's just say Genesis, for example, but beyond Genesis, through a Kabbalistic lens, it makes sense in incredible ways that it doesn't make, reading it. You said, well, what they're talking about, they actually talk about 3 stages of the creative process. So it seems repetitive, but it's because they're talking about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 in Kabbalistic terms. and that's really what the Kabbalah really is about, is I always said it's like mystical physics. And if you understand how to understand what they're talking about in terms of, well, like, these dimensions and things like that, and the sacred geometry involved and why they're saying what they're saying, it becomes, a deeper and deeper penetration into the real nature of things that's very specific and very precise. And I think science is confirming it with its much more primitive mechanisms. I was a science proofreader, medical and scientific proofreader for years. And I realized, well, they are whistling in the dark, talk about, they would say that about the spiritual side, but you can make statistics say just about anything. And even with the same data and the same experiment, there would be 10 different interpretations that would turn all the other 9 on their heads with perfectly viable explanations and interpretations. So then that would lead to another study and then 10 more interpretations of that. And it was incredibly circular and incredibly conventional in its thinking. They follow these assumptions and just end up chasing their tails and discounting perfectly obvious things that are definitely a factor in the experiment, like the placebo effect. Well, so why not study the placebo effect? Why just try to discount it? It's proving the power of the mind.
Yeah, one of the things I want to show you with what Marjorie just said was in the Kabbalah, they have these 10 Sephiroth. And if in this picture here, that's a geometry picture, we have 26 dimensions, 4 here for space-time, another 4 over here for space-time, that's 8. And then we have 3 6-dimensional subspaces here. But this one in the middle here has 3 holes in it. This one on the right in the middle has 4 holes, and the one at the very bottom that is linked to these two has 8 holes, okay? 8 holes in it. And so what happens is 3 of these holes in the one that's in the middle linked to 3 of the 8 holes in the one at the bottom. For the 4 holes here in this one linked to 4 of the 8 holes in the bottom, and therefore the thing on the bottom has 2 dimensions that have a hole that connect them, because there's a total of 8 holes here. And so the net result is if I take 8 holes and subtract it from these 18 dimensions, 3 times 6, then I end up with a 10-dimensional space, which is not what I've drawn here. I'm just trying to show you where this thing came from. But the 10-dimensional space is what the Kabbalah, what they in deep prayer, in deep meditation, they were able to see these 10 actual not dimensions without any holes. The holes for them had disappeared. Here I put the holes in so you could explicitly see them, and so you end up with a misleading picture of what they actually saw. But they saw this in the year 0. They all of this was known to these people, and you'd have to ask yourself, how in the world did they do this? What was going on here? And you might ask yourself, suppose that you went and observed this, could you make sense out of it? That's one of the problems with observing the things that Ron Cowan did was you need a framework to try and figure out. I just saw something. Where in the world does that fit in? If you don't have some sort of picture or model or preconceived notion or hypothesis, you're looking at these things and you have no idea what's going on. They're just pretty pictures. I mean, it's an amazing fireworks show, but beyond that, who knows? And then that's probably true for most people that looked at these things, was they had no framework to interpret them, which is what we're trying to provide here. But that's we're saying this is a useful framework. These other people are not idiots. They went ahead and they saw all this stuff, and they came back and said, oh, we have these these 10 Sephiroth out of our tree of life. And that was sufficient for them. They were more than happy with that. That gave them everything. Let's see. Then what is the time here? 8:40. Okay. Why don't we we'll wrap it up here. The one thing that's funny about this is we keep coming back to these notions of what are called compactified dimensions. And the idea here is, suppose we had an axis that went out of the page, out at us, okay? Where in the world could we have another dimension? Well, we could think of a sheet here, which would actually be 2 dimensions here, and that sheet would be wrapped around this axis that's coming out here, so that even though we're measuring what's going on, if we look very closely at the axis coming out here, we'd see there's a whole other space there that is just wrapped around that axis. Okay, so these dimensions are there, but they're very small. They're very hard to see, and but these are things that Ron Cowan went ahead and saw in terms of trying to make sense out of things. This appears to be what is really going on, and this is just, again, an idea of a mathematician to explain what might be going on when you have more dimensions than just 4. He went to 5 dimensions here, and he said, well, if we have 3 for space and 1 for time, where in the world is this 5th dimension? And concluded it had to be some sort of compactified dimension, which is what this picture is here. Not something that's very hard to get your hands around if you haven't seen this before, and it just seems to be words, but the words get the point across. There are 2 gentlemen, an Italian mathematician, Calabi, and a Chinese mathematician, Yao, who together went a long way toward putting these compactified dimension manifolds on a very solid mathematical footing. And the fact is that the work that was done here is actually just trying to prove that these manifolds exist. Got a Fields Medal for the Chinese guy here, and the Fields Medal is the equivalent of a Nobel Prize. So this is not something for the faint of heart to sit there and say, oh, I've got, I'm going to deal with these compactified dimensions. And you can see that, getting the equivalent of a Nobel Prize is what it takes to figure out what makes these things tick here.
And it's not just the New Age bimbos saying it.
No. And we also had this notion of time, which is very different than these other spatial dimensions that we've been talking about. And so here we live in the instant of the now. So this means that the past is behind us, it's gone. The future lies ahead, and only the now or the present exists. But even that is fooling you. You can, if you think about that with this notion of non-duality, of stepping outside of this, you'd realize that the time is not really the sort of dimension that we dealt with in having 3 spatial dimensions, for example. The Easterners, I think, came up with a bunch of interesting ways of looking at this, and we just cited, looking at meridians and acupunctures there, or looking at the chakras in the Ayurvedic tradition, or the Japanese tradition of Reiki, or the Feng Shui, sorry, Chinese side of things. So there's people get too hung up on the West having all the answers, and these are really deep concepts that have been developed by these other people here.
And so much of these things, it's all in the paradigm, and if you don't even understand the paradigm, let's say, of alchemy, you don't know what you, and I feel this way about astrology. You don't know what you're dismissing. You don't have enough of a grasp of the subject to evaluate it. You have to have enough grounding in it to even understand what it's saying.
Yeah, and alchemy is a perfect example because even in the East or in the West, it was a spiritual practice and an art form that seeked purification of the soul and hopefully gaining immortality. But at the same time, you were dealing with the transmutation of chemical elements of different sorts. The one that's cited the most is trying to turn lead into gold. But that's more a notion of trying to achieve perfection or enlightenment is a metaphor for what we're trying to talk about here. And the spiritual transmutation means we have an awakened consciousness that's present in all forms in which created the universe. This is the Jung's collective unconscious. This is the information blocks that Ron Cowan saw everywhere, coating the walls of the compartments of space itself. It's what underlies everything here.
And they were really hoping to show a continuum,
right,
of reality, that if you can do this symbolically, if you can do this in your essence, who's to say it can't be done physically? Maybe the same laws do carry over. I do believe levitation is possible. I don't know exactly how they're doing it to, what they do to your weight, their weight to do it. But maybe these transmutations actually are physically possible, like time travel, once you really understand the deeper concepts.
The thing that came
crazy.
out of this with Ron Cowan was that those compactified dimensions actually are where we can control the forces, the fields and forces of the space that we're in. So if you want to, for example, float in the air, you have to be able to meditate and focus into that higher realm, and you'll be able to, in fact, take the force of gravity and reduce it and start to float up off the ground. End of story. But many people have done this, but it's just held in no respect whatsoever in the West because no one's done it under quote unquote controlled conditions. But it has happened again and again. The example that I always cite is Marco Polo stopping on the Silk Road in his journeys between China and Italy, and there were two yogis there that were floating 3 feet off the ground, waiting to greet him, and that was in 1275 AD. So, I'm not making this stuff up. He didn't need to write that. That's what he did. So, we also touched on Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater and the sort of observations that they did that Ron Cowan was able to replicate, that showed the actual structure of these atomic elements, and all of this, when they did it, was unknown at the time, and the notion of these elements having isotopes, having the same number of electrons, the same number of protons, but a different number of neutrons in the nucleus. That was totally unknown. It was done, decades before it was actually conceived of that this is what was going on.
But it was absolutely confirmed. It was absolutely validated once they had the instruments to see and measure.
Right, absolutely. And we touched here on book 3 of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, that this was written in 0 AD roughly, and yet it was probably oral for thousands of years before that. So they're saying that an individual has 2 parts, an innermost part called the true self, or your soul, whatever you would like to call this, and then an outer or surface part called the ego, mind, or the illusory self. So we have a mind, some intelligence, and some ego there. That is the outer or surface part, but the true self is the innermost part to keep in mind. And then mastering the ways of the ego mind or knowledge of the true self makes pure awareness indeed possible, pure soul awareness possible. So this is, again, written down 2,000 years ago. I'm not making this up.
We take classes in this every month that are just wonderful. With
Yeah.
the yoga teacher that Bart has worked with for decades, and we've been working with her together for a couple of years, and it's just so amazing that this technology exists. It's a spiritual technology that's so clear and so codified and worked out. You know, they think that he was probably more like a committee of individuals, but people really worked these things out, how it works and what to do, and you know, different kinds of problems that arise, and well, you can take this approach, you can take that approach, and it's just incredibly practical. That's what I like about it so much. It's applied, you know, spirituality.
Yeah, the book 3 deals with all of these different things that you can do, like levitate or clairvoyance or whatever, all of these powers. Book 1 deals with all of the how to get centered. So we're dealing with calming your mind, with stretching to get your body calmed, all the muscles in your body and so forth. And so it goes. So I'm just looking here. I think we're going to quit at this point. Yeah. So that's giving you a hint of what we're going to do, but I'm going to go back and pick up on some of these ideas in more detail to explain how much of the action is in these higher realms, in these six real dimensional subspaces that actually form one 10-dimensional subspace in total here. And this is where again the higher realms, the music of the spheres, all of the spirits and souls are running around there. That's really where the action is, and we'll see that going through it. But it's very disturbing to Western science, to put it mildly. So with that, any questions? I'm going to get out of sharing screen here. Anybody?
I wanted to share that we actually spent a wonderful weekend refining that diagram that was just up in the other version that went out in the notice for the class.
And the email.
We're like a couple of really bizarre nerds that think this is a fun way to spend a weekend, you know, redoing these diagrams again and again. And we're just now like brainstorming yet another version. So the color versions, and it just happened to work out. I think it was there unconsciously in my mind, but I wasn't consciously even using the exact same colors that are in the Calabi-Yau manifold illustration of those greens and oranges and yellows.
Right.
But so, and we're hoping to work with this animation company in the Ukraine. We're really excited to have found them, to get that will give them the core idea that they can then bring to life, because I think that might be the best way to sort of show what we're trying to get at. But we have another version cooking right now that you'll be the first to know about when we start to put them out. And then we hope we'll have an even more vivid depiction of it. It's hard because you're working in 2 dimensions, trying to show even 3. We have a kind of convention for doing that worked out, you know, with drawing cubes and things like that. So we'll be kind of following things like that, but with the animation and the movement, I think you get more of a sense of the depth And so that'll be another weekend.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm gonna just shut it down here unless there's any more questions from anybody. But we're gonna do it definitely a different spin than we did in the first 2 years on what you just heard. So that's all I could tell you. So have a good weekend.
More to come. How exciting.
Yeah, we'll see how we do. Okay. Everybody
Okay,
have
thanks.
a good time. Good weekend.
You
Okay.
too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you all. We couldn't do it without you.
Here we go.